The castle of Valemore woke before the sun did, and so did Mira Ashwood. She had learned long ago that servants who moved quietly and worked quickly were servants who were never noticed, and being unnoticed was the only safety she had ever known. Every morning she rose in the small stone room she shared with two other maids, tied her hair back, and pulled her collar high enough to hide the faint silver mark on her collarbone before anyone could see it. She had carried that mark since birth. It was shaped like a crescent moon wrapped in a thin circle of vines, and though she did not fully understand its meaning, she knew enough to fear it. She had been a small child when her village was destroyed in a single terrible night, the flames swallowing everything she loved, including her parents. A kind old healer had found her hiding in the woods, half frozen and silent with shock, and had raised her under a false name in a village far from anything that might remember where she came from. The healer had warned her, again and again, never to let anyone see the mark. Marks like that belonged to bloodlines that kings feared, bloodlines that had once stood as equals to royalty, and equals were dangerous to a throne that had no room for rivals. So Mira grew into a woman who kept her head down. When the healer passed away, she found work in Draven Castle, home of King Castian Draven, the Alpha King of Valemore. He was a man spoken of in hushed, respectful tones throughout the kingdom, strong, fair in his rule, but cold in a way that made the older servants whisper that something inside him had been broken years ago and never mended. Mira had seen him only from a distance in 3 years of service, a tall figure crossing the courtyard, or standing at the head of the great hall during feasts, his expression carved from stone. She never imagined he would ever look at her twice, and she was content with that. Being invisible meant being safe. That comfort ended on the night of the harvest feast. The great hall was filled with nobles from every corner of the kingdom, their laughter echoing off the high stone ceilings, wine flowing freely as musicians played near the fire. Mira was meant to stay in the kitchens that night, but when one of the serving girls collapsed from fever just before the meal began, the head housekeeper grabbed Mira by the arm. "You, take the high table. Do not spill anything, do not speak unless spoken to, and do not embarrass this house." Mira's stomach twisted with dread, but there was no room to argue. She smoothed her apron, lifted the heavy silver pitcher of wine, and walked toward the long table where the king sat, surrounded by his advisors and his beta, a broad-shouldered man named Rurik. She kept her eyes low as she moved down the table, filling goblets with practiced care. When she reached the king's seat, her hands trembled slightly, though she could not explain why. As she tipped the pitcher toward his goblet, his fingers shifted on the table, and for the briefest moment, her skin brushed against his. It was nothing, a servant's hand touching a king's hand for half a second, an accident that happened 100 times a night in every castle in the realm. But Castian Draven went rigid, as though struck by lightning. His breath caught. His golden eyes, usually distant and unreadable, snapped up to her face with an intensity that made the noise of the hall fall away around him. Something ancient and long silent inside his chest roared awake, a feeling he had not experienced in over a decade, not since he was a young man who still believed in fate. Mira froze, the pitcher trembling in her hands. "Forgive me, my king," she whispered, stepping back quickly, certain she had somehow offended him. He did not answer right away. His jaw was tight, his knuckles white against the table's edge. Rurik glanced at him with concern, but Castian only shook his head once, a silent command to let it go, and Mira was dismissed from the table without another word. She spent the rest of the night trying to convince herself she had imagined the look on his face. She had not. Castian barely slept. He paced the length of his chamber, until the candles burned low, his wolf pacing with him, restless and insistent in a way it had not been since he was young. He told himself it meant nothing. He told himself exhaustion and old grief could play tricks on a man's senses. He had buried the last of his hope for a fated bond years ago, on the night his childhood promise to his intended mate had ended in fire and smoke, the pack she belonged to slaughtered in a conflict that still haunted his dreams. He had accepted, long ago, that whatever bond he might have had was gone with them. And yet his wolf would not settle. The next morning, he summoned Rurik. "The girl who served the wine last night," he said, his voice carefully even. "Find out who she is." Rurik raised an eyebrow but said nothing beyond a respectful nod. He was used to strange requests from his king, though never one quite like this. Mira, unaware that she had become the center of quiet royal attention, returned to her ordinary duties. Grateful the strange moment at the feast seemed to have passed without consequence. For a few days, life continued as it always had. She scrubbed floors, carried linens, avoided the sharp tongues of certain nobles who treated servants as furniture rather than people. It was one of those nobles, a cruel young lord named Phelan, who nearly destroyed everything. Mira had been walking through the lower hall with a basket of laundry when she heard raised voices near the servants' stairwell. Phelan had cornered a young maid, no older than 15, gripping her wrist tightly enough to bruise, while accusing her of stealing a ring that had likely simply fallen from his careless hand somewhere in his own chambers. Mira did not think. She never had, when it came to protecting someone smaller and weaker than a bully twice their size. She stepped between them. "Let her go," Mira said, her voice steady, despite the fear pooling in her stomach. "She has done nothing." Phelan turned his anger toward her instead, shoving her back hard enough that she stumbled into the stone wall. Her collar tore at the shoulder in the struggle, and before she could pull it closed again, the fabric slipped just enough to expose the crescent mark at her collarbone. Time seemed to stop. Castian had been crossing the corridor above, alerted by the commotion, and he arrived at the top of the stairwell just in time to see it. The moment his eyes landed on that silver crescent wrapped in vines, every wall he had built around his heart cracked apart at once. He knew that mark. He had seen it only once before, on the wrist of a small girl he had promised, as a boy of 10, that he would find again someday. A promise made beneath the moonlight of a pack that no longer existed. "Get away from her," Castian said, and though his voice was quiet, the authority in it sent Phelan stumbling backward in fear. The young lord fled without another word, sensing danger he could not name. Mira yanked her collar closed, her whole body shaking, not from the fall, but from the look on the king's face. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something rawer, something closer to disbelief and grief, and hope, tangled together so tightly they looked almost like pain. "Who are you?" he asked, stepping closer. "No one, my king," she said quickly. "Please, forgive the disturbance. I only meant to help her." "That is not what I asked." His voice was gentler now, though his hands trembled slightly at his sides. "Where did you get that mark?" Mira's throat tightened. She had spent her whole life hiding this exact moment. "I was born with it," she admitted finally, too frightened to lie to a king who was already looking at her, as though he could see straight through every wall she had ever built. "I do not know what it means. I have only ever been told to hide it, or I would be in danger." "You have no idea what it means," Castian repeated softly, almost to himself. Then quieter still. "It means you are mine. It has meant that since before either of us understood what fate was." Mira's blood ran cold. She had heard stories about marked bloodlines being hunted, about fated bonds being used as political tools, about servants disappearing when a noble decided their blood was inconvenient. She did the only thing her instincts told her to do. She ran. She did not stop to gather her belongings. She simply fled through the servants' passage, out into the courtyard, toward the gates, driven by a fear that had lived inside her since childhood. She had survived by disappearing once before. She would do it again, if it meant staying alive. She never made it past the gates. Castian caught her there, his long strides closing the distance faster than she could outrun, though he stopped short of grabbing her, keeping enough space between them to let her breathe. "Please," Mira gasped, backing against the iron gate, tears burning in her eyes. "Please don't punish me. I never asked for this. I never wanted anyone to know." "Punish you?" Castian's voice cracked with something close to heartbreak. "Mira, I am not going to punish you. I have spent 13 years believing you were dead." She stilled. "You know my name." "I have always known your name," he said, stepping closer, his golden eyes glistening in the torchlight. "You do not remember me, do you? You were small. There was smoke and fire, and I was pulled away before I could reach you. I was told your entire pack was destroyed that night. I mourned you for years, Mira. I built walls around my heart, because I believed my fated mate had died with everyone else I loved. The truth settled over her slowly, piece by piece, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The healer who raised her had never told her the full story of that night, only that she had to hide, that her survival depended on silence. She had never known there was someone on the other side of that darkness who had also been searching, also grieving, also carrying a promise, made beneath moonlight neither of them had forgotten. "I thought you were gone too," she whispered. Castian reached out slowly, giving her every chance to step away if she wished. When she did not, his hand came to rest gently against her cheek. "You were never gone. You were only lost. And I have been searching for you longer than you know." Word spread through the castle quickly after that night, though not in the way the nobles expected. There was no scandal, no punishment, no quiet disappearance of an inconvenient servant. Instead, 3 days later, Castian stood before his full court in the great hall, Mira at his side, her collar removed, her mark uncovered for the first time in her life without fear. "This woman," Castian announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall, "is not a servant of this house. She is the last surviving heir of a bloodline this kingdom owes a great debt to, and she is my fated queen, chosen not by my will but by fate itself, long before either of us understood what that meant." The hall fell silent. Some nobles exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared speak against a king whose devotion was written so plainly across his face. Phelan, seated near the back, said nothing at all, wisely choosing silence over the consequences of his earlier cruelty. Mira stood tall for the first time in years, no longer hiding, no longer shrinking to make herself smaller and safer. The girl who had once scrubbed these very floors in silence now stood in the center of the hall, not because of any crown, but because of a strength that had carried her through every hardship life had placed before her. Castian took her hand in front of the entire court, the same hand that had trembled the first time their skin had touched over a goblet of wine. "The hall where you once served without a voice," he said softly, only for her, "will now be the hall where you are heard." Mira looked out over the room that had once made her invisible, and for the first time in her life, she did not feel afraid of being seen. Outside, the sun rose over Valemore as it always had, but inside the castle walls, everything had changed. A servant girl, who had spent her whole life disappearing into corners, had finally stepped into the light, not as someone's burden to hide, but as someone's fate to cherish. And in the quiet after the court dispersed, when it was only the two of them standing beneath the high windows of the great hall, Castian pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead and whispered the words he had waited 13 years to say. "Welcome home, my queen."